All right, so I'm here with Fiona, who I call my friend. Hello, Fiona. But to you guys, who may or may not know, she is a huge star at BBC Radio Humberside, probably the biggest star they've got, my favourite, definitely.
Huge star. You're going well. Keep going.
Am I doing all right, considering I'm
Yeah.
the one who gets interviewed? So today she would have a quick chat with me because my new book that's coming next year, in June of 2021, gosh, 2021, it's paperback, and in April it will be ebook, and it's called This Is How We Are Human, and it's inspired by a real life young man who's autistic, and that man happens to be Fiona's son. So Fiona, tell us that day when we met in that restaurant, didn't we? And you were having a hell of a time, and the conversation we had that inspired this book.
Well, often you've always said to me that every story you write is always inspired by something. And I remember coming to see you and I was in a terrible state because my son was at that age where he was really interested in sex. And that's all he could talk about. And he was like, 18 at the time, 19 at the time. And he wanted to have sex. He is autistic. He has a different view of the world. We call it autistic perception. Autistic spectrum perception is what he calls it, and he's quite right too. The reason he's not on here, by the way, is because he's shy, and he just told me to do it. So he'd probably come in a minute. But the thing is he was interested in sex, and it became quite obsessive, like this interest. So I went to see if there was any kind of help, specialist help or advice that someone could give me about how to talk to him about safe sex and about because he has hard time reading facial gestures, about being able to consent and stuff, and the emotional maturity needed to have sex, and and just about the kind of ins and outs, pardon the pun, of it. And there was no help. There was nothing. Various specialists almost shrugged their shoulders and said, well, it's not really something we've ever talked about. Some of the safe sex clinics, advice lines were quite helpful, but it wasn't geared towards an autistic person. Not my autistic person anyway. I call him mine, but my boy, not my autistic boy. And I know you can't gear everything to everybody, but I just was so alone. There was no advice whatsoever. And I was just kind of left to deal with it, just given a handful of leaflets by one particular organisation, and just told to kind of, well, you're his mother, you sort it. So you can imagine me being out in the street, handful of leaflets, and then we met for lunch, and that was it really. I told you the story, and there was part of it, and I remember saying to you, a thought had crossed my head in that kind of desperation moment, because he was so obsessed with having sex and he was having a hard time meeting somebody. I thought, God, what if I hired a professional? What if I just hired a professional and he could just have his leg over? And would that satisfy him? Would he be quite happy with that? I don't know. And we laughed about it at the time, didn't we? And you were like, oh, come on, he's well able to find somebody, and don't be worrying, and he'll fall in love and all this. And I was like, oh, I don't know. It was just so stressful. And at the time we laughed about it and everything, and of course I dismissed it immediately. But you were like, oh, hang on, what if you hadn't dismissed that thought? What actually if you followed through with that? What would happen? So that's how we came about, wasn't it?
It was, and it was just, for me, a magic moment, because for me, when a story is born, especially what we felt was such an important story, because I don't think in that moment I said to you I'd like to write it. I think I came right.
Yeah.
And it was churning in my head, and I already had this girl in my head, this young woman called Isabel. I already had her, but I didn't have a story for her, and she was a nurse, and she was having to be a high-class escort to pay for her dad's care, to pay for a degree. I already had this character, and when you told me about Sean, I was like, oh my God, what if he, or the character inspired by him, meets Isabel? And I think the next day I messaged you, didn't I? And I said, I really want to write this story. And I felt like I not had to get your permission, your blessings may be a better word, and just thought I need Fiona's blessing, and I probably need Fiona's help. And you really, really, really made me emotional, because you said, if anyone can tell this story, you can. That is what you said.
True. because I wouldn't have trusted anyone else to tell it. And it's such an important story because it addresses so many misconceptions, but also so much prejudice that a young autistic man faces. Now, I'm going at this from being his mother, from having to witness this and experience this from the time he was very little. And I have twins, both on the autistic spectrum.
On the wall, Fiona, all of them on the wall.
Oh, they're much bigger now. Some babies. But I have twins who are both on the autistic spectrum. So, and they are now both 22. So this has been like, half my life battling for them and having to, witness discrimination against them. And when we told our idea to Sean, he was passionate about getting involved and wanting to advise you on the development of the character, but also on the traits, because he felt that was really important, that you got his particular traits spot on. And you did.
A little bit of magic, it felt like, happened.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding you, Fiona. It was like I was him when I wrote, because I decided we've got three main characters, haven't we? We've got Veronica, his mum, who is like you, adores her boy. Just, he is her world. But unlike you, she does make the decision to go with the high-class escort for her son, Sebastian. Decides not to tell him, though, so he doesn't.
And that's her first foray into prejudice, isn't it? That's her first, and she doesn't even realize it. And that's what's interesting, is that she fights so hard for people not to be prejudiced against her own boy, and yet that's the very first step that she takes into being prejudiced against him, because she automatically assumes that she would have to pay somebody. And that's what's so interesting about the story, I think.
Yeah, they all bring something different. So she does that. He thinks Isabel's with him because she wants to be. Isabel knows the whole situation and at first has a problem with it, but then something happens to her in the book where she needs the money, so she does. And so they all learn from each other. But I wanted Sebastian to be the only one who had a first person voice, so his voice is the strongest. So they're a third person, everybody else, but he is first person, because I really wanted to speak and be him. But you and I often acted certain scenes out because you knew Veronica. So do you remember we'd sit in that restaurant recording it, and I would say, right, can I be Isabel and will you be Sebastian for me? And we'll back and forth. And I literally used those transcripts for the conversations.
And I loved as well, because when we had lunch with Sean, and we brought your daughter in as well from the point of view of a young woman, and we got them to almost play it out and on how they would address things. And I loved how strict Sean was with you on what kind of language you were to use, and and what how he would react to something, because it was so important for you, I know, to paint a picture that was a reality for him on how he reacted to things and how he felt. And I know there was times you felt like crying in the restaurant, and I think you probably did at some times when he spoke about him feeling lonely and about girls being cruel to him and about him not being about him maybe not meeting somebody. And I think, that was just
one of the most powerful parts. Is there's a little chapter called Sebastian is Lonely, and I used Sean's words literally in the chapter about what it felt like for him to be lonely, and that he's almost like in a fish tank, like his fish. He's different and separate from the rest of the world. Everybody's looking in and thinking they know what's best. Like the story as well, which is a big part of the story, is that he's behind this glass, and everyone's running about going, with all these crazy ideas, thinking they know what's best. If someone just asked him and spoke to him, he's the one who speaks the most sense. I mean, there are some scenes where everybody else, clearly doesn't know what they're doing, but he has the most simple answer and he's always right.
But that's true as well. And I think it was so refreshing that this, when you wrote the story, and when I read it, I thought, you have him spot on there. And I think because you address so many things in the book, in particular, it was people's perception, because of course with autism, it's not one size fits all. Do you know what I mean? And some autistic people prefer different terms and terminology and everything. So I think with this one, we just went with how Sean saw himself and how he felt about himself, and I think that's important to be perfectly clear about. But it was when he came up against people like I did, experts who thought he shouldn't be having sex because they couldn't differentiate between being like having, you know, being autistic and being childlike. And even Sean himself would argue with them saying, I'm not a child, I'm a fully grown man. What is your problem? And it was always him saying, what is your problem? Do you know what I mean? And they had assumed all along, well, it might be your problem because, you know, I can't get my head around how on one stage, you know, you love wearing goggles on your head and you know, shouting about fried eggs. And on the other, you want to have sex. Yeah. And surely that's the point, isn't it? It's our inability to be able to separate the two. And I think it's important as well that we spoke about that.
It is, and you guided me through the chapters. So basically, you, Fiona, I would write a chapter, send it to you, wouldn't you? You'd read it. Often these emotional responses, you know, like, how are you in his head? How is this? And then, and it was a little bit, well, I use the word magic a lot when I'm writing, but it really was. It took me the longest, I think maybe because of the back and forth and a lot of editing. That took me the whole of 2018 to write that one.
I think that was because of the research involved, because there had to be so much. And you yourself, I remember you saying to me, I have to get this right. You know, I have to get this right to do it justice, which you did. But I suppose it for your end, it took so much work making sure that, because there was various versions, wasn't there? And that you changed your mind. You're like, oh, I can't do this. Oh, no, you know, and I want to do it this way.
What you mean? That the I was going to do to him, I couldn't do it in the end.
It's because you fell in love with the characters.
I did, because I mean, I do love him in real life, and so I loved him in the story. But and just to wrap up a little bit, you yourself are doing a podcast, aren't you? So just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm going to start recording in January. It's going to be 6-part podcast broadcast on the BBC. And it's going to be from a parents and carers perspective of bringing up an autistic child from diagnosis all the way through to sex and relationships, and then to the legal point of what happens when we're no longer here. You know, who's going to help take care of our children? That's a really sad reality, and I have yet to hear anybody talk about that. So that's my idea is and as soon as I put it on Facebook, I had so many parents and carers contacting me saying, oh, you know, I'd love to be part of this. I want to talk about my experiences as a person, as a parent, as a carer to an autistic person, not an autistic person, but as a carer. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I'm really looking forward to allowing people to tell their stories.
When does it air, do you think? Do you have an idea? Or
I'm hoping, obviously, with this bloody COVID. So we're hoping to record in kind of January. And Cheryl, our Cheryl Wilkinson, will be with me. She's also the mother of a child on the spectrum, but she's also a psychotherapist. So, you know, she has a very useful insight. We're hoping mid-January, and it might be ready. The first one might be ready end of January. And then obviously we'll take it from there, you know. But hopefully as restrictions begin to lift, we can get round and actually talk to people face to face, which would be lovely, you know.
Well, I think, Fiona, that this is going to be something we're going to be long talking about together.
We're so excited about it, though, aren't we? We're so excited.
Yeah, I hope, obviously, we can chat as the book comes out. Maybe we can do another one. But thank you for chatting to me. It's been quite emotional, to be fair. So
and thank you for writing it. It's about time someone wrote something like this, and I think it's going to be a book that certainly changes the world, I think.
Absolute pleasure, honour. So have a lovely day, Fiona.
You too, my love.